President David, members and guests. It's not often that a host starts an introduction with a statement of conflict of interest, but that's what I'm going to do, because I happen to be a proud shareholder in Rex Minerals, for reasons that I hope that Richard makes clear in a moment. Richard's CV is on the front page of the bulletin. I'm not going to go through all of it, but he's obviously had an extensive career in the resources sector, including, I might add, a joint venture, copper-gold joint venture in the Philippines. Well, Richard, our club has something in common with you. We also have a joint venture in the Philippines, but in a rather different sector. Richard's various appointments are listed there, but I just wanted to add, after being a non-executive director of Rex Minerals, about in the middle of last year, he was appointed Managing Director and CEO, which is a pretty fair indication of the esteem with which he was held there. So on that note, I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Richard Laufmann.
Thanks very much, Barry, and thank you all for having me here. I've got my phone on 20 minutes. I'll be done. Look, it's a somewhat difficult time to come and talk to anyone, I think, at the moment, when so many dollars have been torched by the mining industry. And we're in the mining industry. Oil and gas has joined us, and there's a few more sectors heading our way. But before I start, I felt, given the diversity in the room, and I didn't want to bore you all to death with a talk about the Hillside project, which I'll touch on, it's a little bit hard to ignore the elephant in the room. In the last 12 months, say 18 months, the resources sector has torched about $1.4 trillion of shareholder value. And to put that in perspective, if you took Apple, Alphabet, Google, so your iPhone, Google and Exxon out of the picture entirely, that's what the mining industry has torched. To paint that picture a little bit more specifically, a friend of mine now runs Anglo, and most people in this room will remember Anglo as one of the heavyweights in the sector. In 2008, Anglo was worth about £50 billion, $75 billion dollars. Today, Anglo's worth £3 billion, about 60% the value of Newcrest. So it's only a mid-tier. That's how much money we're torched. I think what Barry's talking about is at one stage Rex was valued around $3 and it's valued around 10 cents or less. So, we've lost a lot of money. So I wanted to just follow that theme a little bit further. We have a project on the Yorke Peninsula, and it's a pretty decent project in the old world. Today, it's in the toilet like most projects, so it's not particularly exciting. But I just want to talk to you about where it's come from and where we're headed, both as a sector and within the sector, the minerals industry. Now, this is a chart. This is a chart of I'm stuck to this lectern, but look, this is a chart of annualised primary copper demand globally, going back a long, long time. So copper's been in use for a long time. I just want to point to two really stellar facts on this. Between 85 and 2008, right, in that 23-year period, we consumed globally about half the copper ever produced and used on planet Earth, and it's been used for a long time. And if you step forward, and I've dragged this slide from my archives. I gave this slide in 2008 to a shareholder meeting in Melbourne. 2008 is a world ago. I mean, that was a different era in 2008. I still had a freaking Ericsson mobile phone. I'd never heard of an Apple iPhone. If you cast forward from 2008, so this was predictive. You'd look and see that the world before 2030 was going to consume more copper than it had in its collective history. Now, we're lucky because we can look back at this and we can disassemble that graph and we can see that in 2015 it was actually correct. That's the copper we were using, give or take a few tonnes. So we had a pretty decent forecast. What I've also done is stripped China out for you. You can see China almost didn't exist about 85 as a copper consumer. And this is really important because copper's been coined and phrased as a proxy for development. And it is not a bad raw material proxy for economic development. But in 85 through 2008, there was something not really on the radar screen when this slide was put together. China was being talked about quite heavily when this slide was put together. Even if you strip China out, if the place didn't exist, there's still a massive increase in demand, around 4% per annum required for copper on average. And there's a very good reason for that. I don't want to get into a discussion here and today about things like global warming, whether you're for it or against it. The fact of life is our future's been legislated largely on our behalf. And one way or another, we're going to pay to electrify and use more efficient forms of energy consumption. And one of the primary forms of energy consumption on planet Earth is the mobile car and the power station. And we all know coal's a dirty word. Well, it doesn't matter what you're going to build if it's not coal, it's going to use a bucket load more copper. And one of the primary uses of copper is the electric induction motor. And if you have an old motor, you have about 0.7 of a kilogram of copper per kilowatt produced. It's called an inefficient motor. And if you have one of those whiz-bang motors that they put in skateboard wheels now because they're super small and super powerful, and they're now hiding them in bikes on the Tour de France, as we've seen, right? And they're really pretty powerful, but you fit them right inside. Those things have got about 2.7 kilograms of copper per kilowatt produced. That's a highly efficient engine. If you're going to make any difference to carbon emissions on planet Earth, you're going to use bucket load more copper than was ever talked about when this graph was put together. And that was being used before. So copper has a multitude of uses, and I'm not going to spruik the story of copper. I'm just going to say it doesn't matter. Your future's been predetermined. I personally like a big V8 that makes a lot of noise as a car or a motorbike that makes a lot of noise. That's what I like to drive. But we're all going to be driving versions of Teslas in 10 years from now and working out how to fund the distribution of electricity to those Teslas. And that is going to require an awful lot of copper. That's the fundamental setting for copper. So as we look forward, there's some few salient facts. We don't have the copper to supply even the modest 4% per annum growth forecast, assuming we don't have an out-of-control Indian or Chinese economy. You have commodities like oil, fuel, coffee, copper, that some New York Goldman Sachs analysts coined OPEX commodities. They're what you require if you have an operating economy. If you have a constructing economy, an emerging economy like China, you need cement and steel because you're building heavy infrastructure. So once economies like China kick over, they build a lot of infrastructure, then they have the opportunity for a consumer economy to develop. 70 cars, I think there's about 70 cars per 1,000 people in China, and there's around 600 in most of the Western world. And if most of those cars are going to be electric, that level of copper consumption has never been contemplated in the world. We have a massive supply gap coming forward with copper. Even if we look, and I pulled this out of my archives too, because this was a forecast projection of what was going to happen in the micro market for copper. It's dating back about 2 years ago. So 2016 and 17 were always going to be slightly positive years as far as we're going to have more copper produced than we needed to consume. So it's not surprising that price has sort of dropped to accommodate that. But that's been coming for a long time. What we can't do is predict when these prices are going to, move and whether they're going to move in unison. But I just wanted to paint a framework for you of why copper is important. If you care about planet Earth and the future your children will live with, well, you got to care about copper. It's a useful part of our life moving forward, and it's not a replaceable part. There are some things that if the price goes up, you can substitute something else for. You can't substitute copper as an efficient conductor. People use aluminium sometimes when you want something light and cheap, but it's not got the same properties of copper. So it's a pretty darn important commodity globally. If you talk about iron ore, which is BHP, because they've got their shares as well, and Rio Tinto, well, 1/3 of planet Earth is iron. You can't get away from it. There's iron in every country. The difference is the quality of the ore body and the commercial viability. But there is not copper everywhere. So you can't just walk out and start digging copper where you would prefer to or where it's strategically sensible. You've got to go looking for it and take it where you find it. In that regard, it's more strategic. Well, a long time ago, a friend of mine identified South Australia as one of the most underexplored places on the continent and one of the best prospective places in the world to look for copper. This was going back to about 85. I used to work for a big company called Western Mining. I subsequently moved on to BHP and then trod a different path. But that stuck with me, and he went off and I followed him, and we explored in South Australia, and we had a discovery on the Yorke Peninsula, the Hillside project. On a global scale, it's a fairly small project. In an Australian context, it's very important. We now have a plan to mine an open pit. It's fairly shallow. If anyone's interested and knows about how you extract copper, it's not too sexy. It's pretty simple. The technology behind the actual chemistry set that we use to separate the copper from the ore body, that can get a little bit technical. But in this case, it's a pretty clean ore body. We don't have one of the nasty elements that you often find with copper. So if you go anywhere around the world and you look for copper, you often find arsenic. And arsenic's a bit of a problem globally. In South Australia, you all talk about uranium. Now, I can understand why, but it's not really relevant in the context, even though it's part of the ore bodies. Like we don't actually have a problem with radiation or anything. It's just it gets people's attention. But arsenic's actually a bit nasty, and you don't have arsenic in South Australia, not much of it, and that's really positive. So this is a pretty clean ore body as far as ore bodies go. We require about 480 million to build this mine. So relative to development costs in the mining sector, that's a pretty easily digestible quantity. Last project I was looking to fund was about 6.5 billion. So 480 million is like a bit of a walk in the park when liquidity is around. This mine should remain competitive even with commodity price fluctuations. Today, commodity prices have taken a swan dive from the top story. Copper price is around $2 a pound. This mine would operate at a cash cost of around $1.60. What that means is if it was in production, that's pretty good insurance that you're not going to have to lay off your workforce and close the doors when the price moves and oscillates, and all prices do. Right? It's not a great return for bankers and investors at that point, but at least they're not stressing that you're not going to be able to keep paying your way forward and refinancing. That's just something to look at. It's not the picture in total. It's going to produce about 35,000 ounces, tonnes of copper and 25,000 ounces of gold. Gold's also part of the ore body. By the way, iron ore is a big part of the ore body too. All the iron ore that comes out of this mine will be stockpiled in the tailings facility. And one day, if iron ore prices go back up, it can be recovered. So this mine has an initial plan of 13 years. It's got ore body potential for about 30 years, but it's got an operating life opportunity that exceeds that. And so does the regional geology support that. What I've done is just to give you, in a way that I can't really describe this to you sensibly.
Rex Minerals has projects in South Australia.
I didn't know you had a sound
which is
system,
one of
so I'll
the most
shut up and let the
prospective
guy talk.
locations in the world for large-scale copper and gold. Rex discovered a large copper-gold deposit called Hillside in 2008. Hillside is located 60 kilometres from the city of Adelaide and 150 kilometres by Sealed Road. The Hillside deposit is well defined, made up of a number of parallel ore bodies or lenses containing a total mineral resource of 2 million tonnes of copper and 1.6 million ounces of gold. The ore body starts at just 20 metres beneath the surface, and initially shallow open pits will be developed to commence production at Hillside. The starter pits will be followed by a series of larger open pits. The location of the waste stockpiles, tailing storage and processing plant are all within close proximity. The current open pit design has a mine life of over 13 years. This mine life could grow substantially by expanding the open pit or using underground mining methods. The ore body also remains open at depth, and Rex expects that the mineral resource will continue to grow with further drilling. The mineral processing plant utilises flotation technology to produce a copper and gold concentrate. The copper-gold concentrate will be transported by truck to Port Adelaide using an existing sealed road. The local area has an existing water network which is managed by the local water authority, South Australian Water. Rex has already co-funded the expansion of the water pipeline to Port Wakefield, which is now installed and operating, with the remaining proposed expansion to be co-funded between Rex and the South Australian Government. The Hillside project will also be connected to the existing power network, which is situated within 12 kilometres of the Hillside project. At the conclusion of mining, the site will be progressively rehabilitated to match the existing landscape and incorporate community feedback, which will include both agricultural and tourist activities.
I've never actually heard that before. I've never had it play, so I'm sorry about that. It just came on, but that's awesome. It said it better than I would have anyway. That's just to give you a little bit of a visual understanding of the footprint that we hope to operate in and leave behind when we're finished. Well, from a South Australian perspective, what are some of the headlines? And at this point, I just, very quickly, because my time's up, but I just want to reference, I've just reviewed the draft of the South Australian copper strategy. It's a pretty good initiative. You really do have an opportunity here for copper projects, and I think it's a metal of the future. It's going to be required more and more. This mine alone is pretty modest in size, is 500 jobs for as long as it's around for. So it's pretty significant in the context of the Yorke Peninsula. And look, by area, visually, by dust, by any metric you would like to apply, it's very low impact. Right? It just doesn't take up a lot of space. When we talk about the tailings that we're going to put there, the average gradient on these things is 15 degrees. So from where I'm standing, it hasn't even reached the height of the back window by the time you're that far away. So it's a pretty low imprint project. It's not a bad one to have if you're going to have a project. This is really produced for the community, so I won't dwell on it. But we've brought more fresh water into the region. We can use saline water in our processing. We've got quite a low footprint in that regard. We don't really make a mess of the place, which is a big perception about mining. This is a pretty cute mine to have if you're going to have a mine. And it's in a pretty good location. If anyone's familiar, and everywhere I go in Australia, someone knows someone at freaking Black Point or something. I cannot get away from this place. I overseas and talk, and someone says, I got a friend in Black Point, and they tell me, South Australia, I can't get away from it, wherever I go. Well, there you go. We're going to have 16 trucks wandering around on the site. We had initially a much larger plan with iron ore, not anymore. 16 trucks, you won't hear them or see them. People talk about the highway, the load on the highway. That's me to stop. They talk about our load on the highway. There's 200 of these big BWs travel during harvest, and we're going to bring 5 from Adelaide and send 7 out. So we don't have a big impact on the highway. So we don't actually have the impact people might assume. I won't talk to you about this, but it's a really exciting state to explore in. Over 1/3, nearly 40% of drilling companies in the US have now filed for Chapter 11. So this route in the resource sector is going to play out in 10, 15 years' time. So the government initiative on the copper strategy is fantastic. More of that is required to encourage people to look, because if we don't find these deposits with the 20-plus year life cycle to get approvals and developments in place, you won't have that copper. I just put this slide in to finish because I kind of felt like I'm standing up here to talk a little bit about bad news, and then I'm selling my own story, copper. Don't worry, she'll be right, mate. And it is a bit of a bad news environment, but I love a lot of things. And 21 December, before Christmas, and I couldn't believe this, the second greatest event in my life happened. The greatest event was when I remember Neil Armstrong walking on the moon, and I've never gotten over it. But then it didn't even show on the news. I don't know if you got it here in South Oz, but we didn't in Victoria. No one mentioned the fact that the bloke who makes a Tesla also owns SpaceX, and they landed a booster rocket. They took off, put 11 satellites into orbit at 75% less than NASA's ever done before in cost. And he landed that booster rocket back down on the landing pad. And in January, he landed one on a ship. And the only news press was, it fell over after it landed, so it was a failure. Right? We landed a rocket. I've only seen that in the movies. That's going to bring down the cost of putting satellite in orbit 100-fold. What a great bit of news, and you don't hear about it. There's a lot of good stuff going on. I don't think the future's as bad as a lot of people today think it is. We've just got to make it through the rainstorm, that's all. Anyway, thanks a lot for your time, I appreciate it.
We just had a short consultation. We have time for one question. Stephen is first.
Thanks very much. Fascinating presentation. With the price of copper and the demand for it, what about recovery of all the copper that's been mined, used, and presumably it's not actually burnt up or consumed, so it's out there somewhere?
Yeah, look, that's always been the case. About 20% of all that supply is recycled copper. Copper's pretty much all recycled. You don't find copper going into landfill anywhere, or just the biggest problem you have is if you put copper anywhere, it gets stolen, right? So yeah, it's all recycled. Sorry, ma'am.
Squeeze in just one, Madeline.
I'd like to know your immediate plans, Hillside, and also, are the Chinese involved in Hillside?
Okay, well, sorry, I missed the what plans?
Plans.
Okay. Yeah, immediately what we're doing is we have a mining licence and we have to work through with the state government our environmental licence, which is called a PEPR over here. So that's what we're working on with the community, so that we do that hand in hand with the community. That's basically our operating parameters. And look, we don't have any Chinese involvement at the moment. In fact, our process plant design, which we paid for, was done by the Koreans. And most of our financing discussions today have taken part with the Korean and Australian banking sector. So that's in reality what we've done. We have about 5% Chinese holders on the register, from a shareholder perspective, about 5%, which is pretty low for a resource company listed on the stock exchange to only have about 5%. But China is definitely an important trading partner for us, and we could end up going with the Chinese company as a contractor to construct. So that could happen, but at the moment it's not very large. Sorry.
Very sorry, we're going to have to cut it short there. I think, Richard, can you stay around for a few minutes? Yeah. So if you've got questions, come and up to the table here and talk to Richard. I'm not sure what sort of impact that had on all of you, but it's made me feel a whole lot better on two fronts. One is my residence of Black Point, and the other is my shareholding in Rex. Don't know what other impact you've had, but you made me feel good. More seriously, it was a really interesting talk by someone who knows. So can you join me in thanking Richard?